Hello, everybody. I am Chris, and my presentation is over the Israel-Palestine conflict, and specifically how the U.S. has been compliant in crimes against humanity and all of the ethical failures that go into that process. We will cover specifically the conflict and some of its history for background, um, the U.S. government and our media, the big media corporations, and how they play into how the U.S. population interacts with this issue, and the military-industrial complex and how they kind of work behind the scenes to make all this happen. We'll go into the conflict. Um, Here's a map of Israel and Gaza, just to give you some reference about like whenever we talk about Gaza, the West Bank, and Israel, this shows like kind of where they are and how large they are relative to each other. Okay, so for some historical context, after World War II, there were obviously a lot of Jewish refugees. There were a ton of people who needed a place to stay after the Holocaust because they needed somewhere to go where they wouldn't be persecuted. So the UN decided to give them 14,000 kilometers of Palestinian land that was formerly British controlled. This, in what was called the Nakba, displaced 700,000 Palestinians and led to the first Israeli and Arab War, where Israel was able to expand to 20,000 kilometers, which was 6,000 kilometers more than what they were initially given. And that's kind of where a lot of this conflict stems from, is the Israeli expansion into Palestinian territory. That is what a lot of what's happening today stems back to. So then we have the Six-Day War in 1967, where Israel is able to capture West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem after some preemptive strikes against Arab nations around them, and they expanded to 89,000. They gave back some land in 1979 with the Camp David peace treaty, and then in 1993 they signed the Oslo Accords after a Palestinian uprising, and said that they would stop expanding into Palestinian land. After they signed the Oslo Accords, they immediately turned around and continued to expand into Palestinian land and displace more settlers. And then now Israel occupies about 35,000 kilometers. In the early 2000s, we had the second Intifada, which was another Palestinian uprising, and there's just been continuous conflict, and Israel has been described as an apartheid state for the way that they treat the Arab people in their nation. There's a lot of discrimination. They do restrict access to a lot of services, and they generally keep the Gaza Strip and some of the West Bank kind of under wraps, as they are Israeli occupied at the moment. So that's some of the history. On October 7th was when the current war kind of really kicked into high gear. There was a surprise attack from Hamas on the Israeli people that led to the death of 1,200 individuals. 800 of them were civilians, including 36 children. 3,400 civilians and soldiers combined were injured. And there were about 250 hostages taken by Hamas at the time. This was, once again, a response to the continuous conflict that's been going on and the general sentiment that Palestinian people have been oppressed by the Israeli state. That's not to say this is justified or anything. Obviously, these are like acts of war and, crimes against humanity committed by Hamas. And it's very unfortunate, but it is a result of what has happened throughout history with between Israel and the Palestinians. So Israel's response was massive military retaliation and blockades and airstrikes on Gaza. The blockades specifically are meant to prevent a lot of aid from coming in, prevent things from like fresh water and electricity from reaching the Gaza Strip. So, what's happening now in Israel? Like we said, 1,200 people were killed on October 7th. About 3,000 were injured, and many of them were children. It was a terrible atrocity, and since then, there's been less than 100 civilian deaths since the war started. 378 military deaths, according to the Israeli government, and over 100 hostages are still being held by Hamas right now. Continuous military action has been taking place by the IDF, the Israel Defense Force, and it's supposedly been targeting Hamas leaders and extremists. In Gaza, there have been over 38,000 people killed, mostly civilians. More than 14,000 of those people are confirmed to be children. More than 80,000 people have been confirmed to be injured, and over 1.5 million people have been displaced from their homes as a result of the Israeli attacks on Gaza. Massive destruction of infrastructure like homes, schools, and hospitals, and Israel claims that the reason for these attacks in civilian areas is because that is where Hamas is taking refuge. Israel is blaming Hamas for this, saying that they had no other choice, and Hamas is saying that they very much have a choice in killing 38,000 different people in civilian areas. International response, people have largely condemned both sides in terms of Hamas and the Israeli government. The U.S. continues to support Israel with rhetoric and military aid. UN Human Rights Council accused Hamas, the U.S., and Israel of crimes against humanity. The EU, European Union Foreign Policy Chief, called it horrifying what Israel is doing in Gaza, and numerous world leaders have caused what Israel is doing a genocide. So here are some headline snippets from recent times about what Israel is doing in Gaza. Freed 4 hostages, killed 274 Palestinians. Seek arrest of Israeli and Hamas leaders, including Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel. Over 1,000 attacks on healthcare in occupied Palestinian territory. 90 Palestinians killed in Israeli strike targeting Hamas. Hospital officials say Israeli strike killed 17 Palestinian civilians in a safe zone. These are just some examples of how Israel is targeting civilian areas. So now we'll get into the U.S. involvement in media coverage and how that's played into this entire thing. Military aid that we are providing to Israel. In 2016, the U.S. pledged $38 billion over 10 years through Foreign Military Finance Program. We pledged another $1 billion in 2021 for the Iron Dome missile defense system in Israel. And then this year, in 2024, in April, the U.S. passed a bill granting another $14 billion to Israel for military aid. At the time that was passed, there were already 30,000 Palestinians confirmed killed by the state of Israel. So I thought that was a little morally questionable of our government to support, but that's just me. What did that money go to? It does go to some defense systems like the Iron Dome and some communication systems. It also goes to fund fighter jets, helicopters, precision missiles. Basically, our government will pay for the development of those weapons and then give more money in the grant form to the Israeli government, and then the Israeli government will take our tax dollars from that grant and then turn around and buy weapons from the private defense contractors in the United States, which we'll get into here in a second. So U.S. media coverage has been largely pro-Israel. Coverage often emphasizes like Israeli right to self-defense and highlights threats posed by Palestinian militant groups, meaning Hamas. And there's often a conflation between Palestinian civilians and Hamas, which are not the same thing. There has been limited Palestinian perspective offered in large media by, like, the New York Times, CNN, MSNBC, Fox News. If you look in those places, you're not going to find a whole lot of Palestinian voices or people who are anti our involvement in this war. Manufacturer consent is the idea that was developed by Noam Chomsky that it's a subtle reshaping of public opinion through media influences that is used to like serve powerful people and corporations who run the media corporations. It selectively highlights certain perspectives, and it's not necessarily propaganda because it's all true and you might have all the information. It's just all about the way that it's presented to you and the way that you're supposed to interpret it. So, for example, the New York Times has been criticized for biased coverage of this war. Some of their conflicts of interest: billionaire Carlos Slim owns 70% of all New York Times shares. He had investments in companies that produce steel tubing, electrical cables, and communications infrastructure, all of which are regularly used for like defense production by defense companies. International investment firms like BlackRock and Vanguard respectively owns 7.4 and 8.1% of New York Times shares, and they also have a lot of stake in defense companies like Lockheed Martin and Raytheon. So you can see how these companies who pay the New York Times, who own parts of the New York Times, are also invested in the war, and they would like to see the war continue, so it makes sense that the New York Times would favorably cover the war. Here's an example of some of their headlines and how they are essentially pro-Israeli defense support. Here you can see Israel rescues 4 hostages in military operation. Gaza officials say scores are killed. When they say scores, they don't say the number, but the number is 210 people were killed to rescue those 4 hostages. When they say Gazan officials say, it is not saying what actually happened. It's saying supposedly. That's making it sound like maybe it did happen, maybe it didn't. Are killed is not saying killed by Israel. This makes it sound like Israel is the good guys and Gazan officials are just happen to be there. They just happen to be killed. You can see how this is problematic. You can see some more over here on the right side. Now we'll go into the military-industrial complex, which is the most fascinating part of all of this. What is the military-industrial complex? The military-industrial complex is essentially made up of a revolving door of people who go from government jobs to private defense jobs and back and forth and vice versa. So, for example, former military officials joining defense companies and the same way around. Behind the scenes, defense contractors lobby for increased defense budgets, and government officials prioritize military intervention and arms production over working for peace and over the good of the American people and people across the world. It makes it to where humanitarian issues are out the window and war is incentivized, which is how we get to war for profit, where these defense companies are guaranteed profit by government contracts with our tax dollars, domestic and foreign demand for their weaponry, means that they can continuously make more money off of our tax dollars and the tax dollars of other nations. And then it also incentivizes them to drag out conflicts like what's happening now, because the longer they keep this war going, the more money the defense company is going to get. So I made up this little animation to show kind of how the military-industrial complex works, specifically right now with this war in Gaza. So this is you, the American people, and you're really happy because you just got paid. You got $200, but here comes the government, and they're gonna take all 200 of your dollars. That's your tax money, and then you're gone. So enter Lockheed Martin, the defense companies. This is what I mean when I say military-industrial complex. And Joe Biden over here is going to take all of your tax dollars and give it to Lockheed Martin. They're going to take those tax dollars and turn them into, you guessed it, weapons and attack planes. So after that, enter Benjamin Netanyahu and the Israeli government. What does Joe Biden do with your tax dollars after that? He gives it to Benjamin Netanyahu, and then the Israeli government takes your tax dollars and gives it to Lockheed Martin, because that's what's in our contracts to begin with. That's why we give them the money, so that they can go give it to the defense companies. And then Lockheed Martin gets our tax dollars again the second time, and then they give the state of Israel all the weapons that they built with our tax dollars the first time. Then enter Palestine and Gaza, and the Gaza Strip, and Benjamin Netanyahu can take those weapons that were funded by our tax dollars and send them over there and drop those bombs on civilians. And maybe that's a crude way to put it, but that is pretty much exactly what happens. Sorry for the crude animation. So some ethical failures and solutions to this problem. Here's some of the ethical failings of the United States and the Biden administration. Specifically, there's conflicts of interest, which we've talked about in class, in our books. There's a revolving door with the military-industrial complex, like I said. This incentivizes war, which I think is generally bad. I don't think we should incentivize killing people. For example, the Secretary of Defense right now for the Biden administration, Lloyd Austin, was literally on the board of directors at Raytheon Technologies right before he became the Secretary of Defense, which is one of the biggest defense contractors in the world, and they build tons of weapons for our military and other ones. Lack of clarity and accountability, failure to acknowledge U.S. complacency in killing civilians. There's no clarity in the decision-making process. The U.S. people don't have any say in this. They just take our money and do what they want with it. They give it to these big companies to make weapons, and they give it to other people to go buy the weapons, and then they let them go kill people with it. So there's not any democratic process for this. There's no consideration of what reflects actual American values or what is the good thing to do. An example of a lack of accountability: Joe Biden claims to be an advocate for Palestinian people, but he refuses to recognize Palestinian statehood, and the United States is one of the few countries in the United Nations and NATO to not recognize Palestinian statehood at all. And that's because of our allegiance to Israel. And then tax-funded genocide. I think that that's kind of a big ethical failing on our part. U.S. military aid used to strike civilian areas in Gaza. That means, like I said, our tax dollars go to make weapons, then our tax dollars go to buy the weapons, and then those weapons go to kill people, innocent civilians, which I'm just not for all that. An example of how we are being complicit in all these war crimes, the Human Rights Council says, the UN Human Rights Council says that the U.S. is complicit in crimes against humanity alongside Israel for killing over 35,000 Palestinian civilians. Ethical failings of the U.S. media. They have obviously failed to fairly cover this issue. Conflicts of interest, corporate ties to the defense industry and Israeli companies means that they have innate bias and innate incentive to show only one side of the story. Defense contractors consistently give advertising dollars to these companies to show their own ads on there, so that's a lot more money that's going straight into the New York Times or CNN. And then stakeholder investments play a role in their reporting angle, so they have to appease their stakeholders if they want to stay in business, because the readers aren't what make the money, it's the stakeholders and it's the advertisers. Bias in manufacturer consent. Reports often take a pro-Israel stance without properly highlighting Palestinian perspectives. They do not do a good job of critiquing U.S. policies, and this only makes things worse for the people who are going through the humanitarian crisis right now, because while the media might claim that their job is to educate, they are obviously not doing so whenever it comes to U.S. foreign policy. This has been the case for decades now. It was the case for the Iraq War. It was the case for the Vietnam War. And that's because, like I said, their advertisers and their stakeholders do not want them to cover this unbiasedly. Potential solutions to the U.S. involvement, not to this conflict. Obviously, I'm not going to solve I'm not going to bring peace to the Middle East in this presentation. I'm specifically talking about our involvement overseas. Policy proposals to reduce defense spending and halt the revolving door at the military-industrial complex, because that's really what drives almost all of these scenarios whenever we're involved overseas and we're just giving people weapons. A lot of it has to do with making money for these big contractors. Jimmy Carter actually tried to implement legislation that slowed down arms sales to allies and made it a little more difficult for the military-industrial complex to profit from war, a little bit decentivize it. That didn't actually work out because the defense contractors shut it down. They have a lot more power than the president. They have a lot more power than a lot of the branches of government. They kind of run all of Congress. So Senator Elizabeth Warren proposed the Department of Defense Ethics and Anti-Corruption Act, I believe, in 2019, and then she reproposed it in 2023. She wants to ban senior Pentagon officials from private defense jobs for the first 4 years after their tenure's up. She wants to limit lobbying power and mandate public disclosure of Department of Defense contracts with companies like Lockheed Martin and Raytheon. So here are some questions that I thought would be interesting to hear you guys' perspectives on. I know that I'm definitely pretty biased in this. I'll be the first to admit that this was a totally biased presentation. That's how I feel about the conflict and our involvement specifically in it. But don't let that stop you from voicing your own opinion. I was just curious what you guys think. These questions will be underneath the presentation too, so I'm not going to read all these out right now. I'm already over my time. And then here are a lot of citations, and if you guys want to check out every single one of them, I welcome you to it. It is interesting. Some of it is kind of sad. I intentionally didn't show you a lot of really horrific photos and stuff because I don't want to see that myself. But yeah, thank you for watching my presentation. Sorry that it took 25 minutes. And please answer the questions. Like and subscribe for more.